Hi, good afternoon. So it is still Sunday and tomorrow is Monday. Woo! So what we're going to do today is we're going to go ahead and we're going to look at the history that you read about on Friday. I'm going to review it, put in some highlights and things. And then we're going to go ahead and talk about the section that you're going to be reading today. I also posted on Google Classroom an additional video that I did last year for the 5th graders about the election of 1860 and the secession of South Carolina, along with many other states. I touch on it a little bit in this video, but that one has a lot more to it. Okay, so let's look back at your lessons from Friday. Sorry. Okay, and we are starting. You don't have to turn there. I'm just letting you know where we're going. On page 224, points of view. So we talked about how the South had a very different point of view regarding slavery than the North. And you read about that. You did a worksheet on it. So I just want to talk about it. So I have some notes on my computer. So if I look like that, that's because I'm looking at my computer. Okay? All right. So the North, so they had more factories in the North, and they would hire workers, and the workers would come in and they'd work in the factories. And they felt that because the workers in the North could choose where they worked, who they worked for, that they were better off than the slaves in the South who could not choose who they worked for, when they worked, or what the job was. The people in the South thought that the factory owners were really kind of greedy and rude, because if a factory worker ever got hurt on the job, they would just tell them to go away and they would just hire somebody else. They'd fire that person. And so what the slave owners in the South said was, hey, when our people get hurt, they still have their house, they still have their food, we nurse them back to health. It's not like we just toss them aside and get a new one. People in the North said, well, yeah, that's kind of true about the factory workers, but hey, they get to choose and you guys don't get to choose. They don't get to choose anything. The North felt that the slave states, something went terribly wrong here in my notes, I'm sorry, felt that the slave states were just not thinking that they could do things better. And that's why that they were keeping these people. They felt that it was wrong to have any people as property, no matter what the reasoning behind it. And they really wanted slavery to end. In the South, they were so wrapped up in the whole plantation and not knowing how their economy would survive without slaves bringing in the crops and things, that they just couldn't see a way out of it. They also felt that they were doing God's work because they had brought these people from Africa, which was a godless nation, to America, and they could teach them the Bible. I've talked this before. If somebody came and kidnapped you from your house and took you someplace and then start teaching about Jesus, would you be like, yay, let's learn about Jesus? Or would you be like, are you kidding me? But God is bigger than that, and a lot of slaves did end up having their own churches and their own stories of the Bible and stuff. And so there was that. Not that that makes it okay to take people from other countries, and that's not okay. Please don't misunderstand. I'm just saying God can use anything at all times. Bigger than man. Okay? Bigger than people. Yes, because God is awesome. The South viewed their values as better. They were very much into duty and honor and courage. And so they felt that they were had better values than the North. It's very interesting to me every time I teach this to go, I don't understand. But this is what they felt. They felt the Northerners were selfish and money hungry, and that's what they felt. Now, the slaves had their own feelings about slavery. One, of course, they didn't want to be property, and they did not feel that the slavery that they were under was a biblical slavery, because again, remember the South, they're talking about, well, the Bible says, you can have slaves and all this, and they saw a big difference between biblical slavery and the slavery they were under. So biblical slavery is not supposed to be perpetual. That means it doesn't go on forever and ever. And the children born to slaves are not supposed to automatically be slaves in biblical slavery. And so that is how they felt it was wrong and different. Again, I'm just reporting. I'm not making, a case for any of this. Anyway, so there was a minister. His name was Daniel Coker, and he was alive from 1780 to 1846. And he was a pastor, and I forgot everything I knew about him just a minute ago. So he was born in Virginia. He was a slave. Hang on, I got the wrong guy. I was looking at Dred Scott. I'm so sorry. Oh my word. All the preparation. And it still goes right. Alright. So, he was the minister at the African Methodist Episcopal Church in America. And he said that the Bible did not allow for slaves' children to be kept as slaves. That was like his big thing. Okay? Now, life as a slave. So, when you were a slave, as we saw in the Harriet Tubman movie, you could be treated very badly, because you were considered property. You were considered, like, if you would think of like a car or a wagon or something like that. You were considered property. And some slaves had very differing lives. So some slaves were on really small farms, not plantations, small farms, and they would work side by side with their owner. They would sleep in the same house. They'd be like up in the loft. And they were working side by side, but they were still a slave. They were not free to go, okay, I'm done now. I want to go work for Fred down the road, because Jeff up the road owned him or her. Okay. Slaves that worked on large plantations had also various jobs. Some of them worked in the house, like cooking or cleaning. Some of them took care of the children. Some of them would serve food, those kinds of things. Others were out in the field picking cotton or tobacco or rice. Or maybe they were mending fences, or they were fixing buildings. But the big piece was that they were not free. They were not free to choose, okay, what they wanted to do, where they wanted to go, because they were owned. Some of the masters treated slaves better than others, and so you had that as well. And I'm sorry. Reading. So most slaves were not taught to read, and at some point in American history, it is actually deemed illegal to teach a slave to read. So if you get caught, even as the owner of the slave, teaching your slave to read, or teaching any slave to read, you could be thrown in jail for that. And the theory behind that was, if you teach a person to read, then they will be able to read things and learn things, and they might rebel against their master. And that was like a big issue for plantation owners, especially in the South, because there were way more slaves than there were the owner, right? And so they were always worried about slave rebellion and things like that. And so they tried to do things to make them feel that they were not equal to the owner, which is not biblical in any way, because God created us all in his own image. We are all from Adam and Eve. We are all the same. So this whole racism thing, judging people because of how much melanin they have in their skin, is totally 100% wrong all across the board. Okay? It does not matter the color of your skin if you are a kind person to others or a mean person to others. It does not matter. We are all from Adam and Eve. We are all created in God's image. So that kind of stuff is just foolishness. And people who think those things are foolish and not very educated. All right. Sometimes owners of slaves would have to make hard decisions because of their finances. They might have to split up a family even if they didn't want to. But you also had ones that were just happy to split up a family, and that didn't bother them at all. Again, it depended on who was working with the slave, who owned the slave, basically. Slaves had strong family ties, and you might say, well, how do you do that when you might break up? Well, you assume, I guess, you're not, and then try to go from there. They developed their churches, they developed songs, they had friends. One thing they didn't have was money, because they weren't free. They didn't earn money, right? They worked, and they had a place provided for them. And it wasn't necessarily a nice place. Some of them had dirt floors. Some of them were really small. Some of them had like pieces missing. And then others were a little bit better off than that. So it all depended. So let's continue. So at this time in history, we're in 1853-ish. Franklin Pierce is the president. He becomes president in 1853. And Abraham Lincoln has been in Congress, and then he runs for like re-election, and he loses to Stephen Douglas. And Abraham Lincoln believes that there should be no slavery, but he is not going to change that. He just wants it to stop spreading. He doesn't want it in any of the territories. He's not very happy about the Compromise of 1850 and the fact that each territory gets to choose on its own whether it's free or slave. He's observed Bleeding Kansas. It's not a good situation. So you have Abraham Lincoln kind of here, and then you have abolitionists kind of over here, because the difference, not that they are opposite in their ideas of slavery, they all think it's wrong, but abolitionists say we need to free the slaves right now, this minute, today, immediately. And so that is what they push for, and they develop their own newspapers, and they have their own mailings, and they send out petitions, and they go around, and they Harriet Beecher Stowe is an author at this time in history, and she writes a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin, and some people read it. It's a super long book, like 800 pages. Anyway, and people read it and they get really upset. They're like, if this is how slave life is, we need to end it now. And so her book is like a pivot into the abolitionist movement, and just an explosion of the abolitionist movement at this time in history, because they're so outraged by what they read in this book that they feel slavery needs to end today, right now. Okay. Some other people said, yes, slavery needs to end, but not today, right now, because we need to give slaves skills before we set them free, because we don't want them to go out into the world where they can't, read, and they can't write, and they can't find a job, and they starve or something. They wanted to do it slower so that they could take care of them, was their thinking. This other group. Okay. Basically, though, in this time, all Americans in the North are so upset about slavery that they are just like fit to be tied. They're just like, we gotta stop it. And so, again, if this would have been taken care of in the very beginning, yes, if we wouldn't have worried about just that one state that wouldn't sign the Constitution, if we would have just gone ahead and said, okay, if you don't want to sign, you don't sign, then we would have stopped slavery way in 1787. But because we did not do that, we did not want to divide the country, it just keeps getting moved down the lane for another group of people to take care of. Okay, let's see. Stop spread of slavery. Checking my notes. Okay, so the fear of the northern people was that the southern states would become way more powerful because the southern states would get more representation because of having slaves. And so again, remember, this was always a battle, right? How many slave states and how many free states we have, trying to keep it all equal and even. That's how we got the Missouri Compromise. That's how we got Texas had to be its own country for a while, because again, it was always about this whole balance of equality in the power, not equality for the people, but equality for the power. So what happens is we have an election in 1856, and slavery affects this election, even though it's not affected like an election 4 years from then in 1860. But in 1856, slavery affects this election, so the Whigs do not agree. This is where the Whigs are going to separate. So you got Northern Whigs who say, meh, slavery, bad, evil, let's get rid of it. You have Southern Whigs who are like, slavery, good, happy times, we should keep it. And so what happens in the political party is that they have a split. So the Whigs go off to their own northern, we want free slaves kind of thing. Later, they actually join with a group called Free Soilers and Republicans, because all of those three groups together are against slavery and want to end slavery, and they decide they could do it together much better than separately. Okay, and the Southern Whigs, they go off and they form a whole brand new party called the American Party. Okay, so you have the Northern Whigs who join the Republicans. You have the Southern Whigs who make their own. Okay, so what happens is that the Democrats, though, they all stick together. They're like, woohoo, we're just gonna take it over and we'll be good. And so they stick together. They don't change any parties. They don't jump on any other bandwagons. They don't separate. So the Democratic Party stays together. The Whigs have separated into two groups. Do you understand? All right. So what happens is James Buchanan and John C. Fremont and Millard Fillmore, they all run for presidency. Now, I had to double check this because I'm like, wait, Willard Fillmore was the president because Taylor died and he became the president, so what's he doing now? So apparently Franklin Pierce is in there between the two times that Fillmore tries to be president. So Fillmore's president because of the death of Taylor, and then Zachary Taylor, right? And then Franklin Pierce becomes president, and then how we say his name wrong, Millard Fillmore wants to become president again, so he runs again. Okay, so these three men run. The one who becomes president is James Buchanan. He becomes the president in 1856, and still everybody's goal here is to keep the Union together and to not look at the slavery issue. No, don't look. No, don't talk about it. Okay? Again, it's not going to work. It's going to keep bubbling up. It's going to keep rearing its ugly head. It's going to just keep coming back until we deal with it, which in the next 4 years will occur in our history. Okay? So, we're going to look at a couple of people. So, in our book, we look at Abraham Lincoln. So, Abraham Lincoln was born in 1809. He was born in Kentucky. Him and his family moved to Indiana. Then he moves to Illinois in his 20s. He is self-educated, which means he teaches himself how to read and write and how to do law and all of these things. He has a little bit of time in a formal school, but not very much. His mom dies when he's young. He has a stepmom who encourages him, and he is definitely against slavery. He feels slavery is wrong, but he also feels that the states have rights under the Constitution. So he said he's not going to make states give up the slavery they have right now. That would be up to Congress. Congress would need to make a law to stop slavery, but he feels it should not spread anywhere else. Okay. So then we go forward to the election of 1860. So the election of 1860 is quite interesting. There's 4 people running in this election. 2 of them are Democrats and 2 of them are not. Okay, so it's divided by the country as well. So you have a northern election kind of idea and a southern election kind of idea, although it's all one election. Do you understand? So the northern people, they get their candidates, and their candidates are Stephen Douglas, and he's a Democrat. He supports slavery. He does something nobody else has ever done, which I do say in my other video. He runs what's called a national campaign. So he goes all over the nation saying, vote for me. Hi, vote for me. Hey, I'm Stephen Douglas. You want to vote for me? Hey, look at me. I'm Stephen Douglas. Don't you want to vote for me? And this is the first time that happens. And he even went into the South, even though he didn't think he'd get any votes. But he went all over the nation. He was from Illinois. Remember, he was against Abraham Lincoln, yes, in the second run for Congress. Okay, in 56. I mean, sorry. Oh, yeah, that's right, 56. Okay, 1856. Abraham Lincoln was the Northern Republican candidate. So he, again, did not agree with the spread of slavery, but he wasn't going to do anything to change the law at that time, because presidents aren't supposed to change the law. It's supposed to be Congress. Yeah. The Southerners, they had their 2 candidates, one of them a Democrat, which was named John Breckenridge. He was from Kentucky, and he thought slavery should be everywhere. It didn't matter if the state had a law against slavery. He thought everybody should be allowed to have slaves if they chose to. So you can have slaves in Massachusetts or Maine, or you can have slaves in Texas or Louisiana. He just felt you could have slaves wherever you lived because, that's just the way he thought it should be. And then there was a man named John Bell, and he's from Tennessee, and there's not a lot about him. He was in his own other party called the Constitutional Union. Okay, so we always have third parties, which I talk about in my other video. Even this last election, the 2020 election, we had somebody from the Green Party and somebody from the Libertarian Party, but you don't hear about them often because the big money is behind a Democrat and a Republican. So that's why you don't hear about the Libertarians or the Green or there's a Constitutional Union might still be a party. There was a constitutional something anyway on the ballot that I saw. So that is always been something that happens. Okay, so what happens is Abraham Lincoln gets no electoral college votes in the South at all. He gets enough electoral college votes in the North to win the election. The populist vote, he got 40% of the vote. But because of the electoral college the way it is, he ends up winning the presidency. Immediately, the South is freaked out and is very concerned that he will get rid of slavery, even though he said he won't, because, and I found this so interesting when I found out, because Republicans refused to follow the Fugitive Slave Act. So the Fugitive Slave Act said anywhere that a slave runs in the United States, you have to send them back to their owner. And anywhere that a slave runs in the United States, he's not free if the owner comes to get him or her. You have to give them back, and if you choose not to, you go to jail. Okay? If you choose to hide a slave, you go to jail. So it was a real big kind of deal thing, because now it was all over the United States. And the Republicans, as a group, refused absolutely 100% to give back the slaves or to help masters find their slaves. So the South felt they could not trust Abraham Lincoln because he was a Republican, that he would just disobey the law of returning slaves and that he would eventually free the slaves. Which, by the way, he does eventually free the slaves during the war, which we'll talk about when we get to the Civil War. All right, so Abraham Lincoln is elected in November of 1860. He doesn't get sworn in until March of 1861, but South Carolina is not going to wait for that. So on December 20th of 1860, South Carolina secedes. To secede means to leave. So they left the United States. They said, hey, we're all done. We're not going to be a state. We're concerned and worried that we're going to lose our ability to have slaves. So we're out of here. Okay. Then they went and tried to get other southern states to join them, which they did within just a few months. Texas, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, and Louisiana all joined South Carolina and said, okay, we're done being a state. Thanks, but no thanks. And so what they do is they join together and they form a new country called the Confederate States of America. Okay, so that's what happens. There's a lot of other stuff, but that's about it for now. So, secret word. Are you ready? Secession. Secession, which means to leave, to separate. Okay? So, I hope you learned some stuff. Please read over the pages for today because I didn't read them to you or anything, and you will probably need them for the worksheets. Go ahead and read and do the worksheets and submit them, please. All right. So you guys are awesome. I can't wait to see you tomorrow, and we're gonna be moving on. Okay. So remember, tomorrow will be Iowa testing. Please get a good night's sleep. Please eat well. Okay, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye, guys.